This paper that you're about to hear is broadly based on a paper I gave to the Conference of Irish Geographers in May in Galway. In early January 2013, following initial work by Stephen and myself, a Google map of derelict sites was made public. So we asked people through social media to place points on a map where they knew there to be dereliction. So 10 people, or now about 20 people after the journal article, have mapped about 200 places in Dublin that we have defined as derelict. So what I want to do tonight in this paper is to explain the motivation for the project, as well as some of the difficulties that we came across doing the project. I outline the methods used to collect the data, and I present a working definition of dereliction for Dublin. So the biggest question for me is why at the end of a sustained property-based boom there are so many derelict spaces in Dublin's north inner city. So we're focusing on that tonight mostly for our work. And why are these still considered private space? Finally, I want to explore some meanings of the geographies of dereliction. So, Buddleia davidii is a woody deciduous shrub that grows up to 4 metres in height. It's, according to the Irish Species Register, it is to be found on waste ground, riverbanks and lake shores. The Register's website says that its distribution is, quote, rare but increasing. The Register probably needs to update its database because if they walk around Dublin, it could not surely be classed as rare. So the anthropologist Mary Douglas defined dirt as matter out of place, which, quote, implies two conditions: a set of ordered relations and a contravention of that order. And that's from purity and danger. So Buddleia is considered to be a weed, but is really a plant out of place. It dominates waste ground and the brickwork of older buildings in Dublin. It sprouts from chimney tops and gable ends, from the wall of Mountjoy Prison and on the numerous derelict sites of Dublin City. So what are the set of ordered relations and the contraventions that its classification as a weed implies? So I'm not going to deal with these relations tonight, but I am using Buddleia, here behind me on the projector, as a marker for the dereliction that we have mapped, hence the title of the paper. Unlike the classification of Buddleia in the Species Register, dereliction in Dublin is not rare. In our short survey of the area between Dublin's Royal Canal and the River Liffey, we have counted 22 derelict housing units of various sizes. This does not include blocks of unused public housing, vacant sites, vacant industrial premises and derelict industrial units. So how did we count? Who and what is counted? More importantly, what is dereliction anyway? In its tally of dereliction, Dublin City Council counts 31 properties on its derelict sites register using these definitions. That's 31 properties for an area of 115 square kilometres. So for a property to be included on this derelict sites register, it has to meet these criteria here behind me. Our dereliction mapping project has identified about 200 sites and buildings alone between the north inner city area between the Liffey and the canal. Why can the council find only 31 where we found about 200? So I'm going to argue here that dereliction, like Buddleia davidii, is not rare, and it is increasingly distributed across more and more of the city area. So Buddleia acts not just as a marker for waste ground or dereliction, but for a set of relationships between the city's inhabitants and global flows of speculative capital. So a research question that we started out with was, why after the longest cycle of property-based accumulation in Ireland's history were there still so many derelict sites in Dublin's north inner city? So in January, Stephen and I marked a few sites on a Google map based on some photography work he'd done on his walk to work in the south of the city and based on pub conversations the previous 3 months. The map had been the first stage in a larger project that we'd been thinking about for about a year. It began by taking photographs and then geotagging these photographs on Google+, and then replacing these on a single Google map. So while Stephen was doing this on his way to work, I was placing points on the map that I knew were derelict from bus journeys, routine walking into the city and so on. A few days later, we made our map public, and within a short time we had managed to enthuse a small number of people around the idea of mapping of derelict sites and houses in the Dublin area. So opening up the map to others, of course, made it less easy to control the placement and definitions of what we meant by dereliction. We invited people through social media to take part on the basis that they could drop pins on the map as collaborators. I think Google's choice of the word collaborators is interesting. We set very few criteria other than a general guideline of a building, and these are our guidelines, that it had boarded up windows and or a collapsed roof. So they were the guidelines that we used to describe dereliction. So we asked people to take a picture of a site, if they could, and add that to the map. As people walked around the city and placed pins on the map, it became evident that these simpler criteria would not be enough on their own. For example, would we map closed retail units? There were dozens in temporary abeyance on a far shorter timescale than many of the original 24 or so housing units we'd mapped originally. So what about sites with a closed retail but an active and lived-in second and subsequent floors? What if a site has a planning notice, even if that now is out of date, attached to it? Maybe stop there. So, yeah. Additionally, by releasing the map into the public domain, but then again is Google public, we could not justify any particular limit to dropping pins. So instead of this being a map of North Dublin City and dereliction, it became a project mapping dereliction in Dublin more widely. So the initial enthusiasm with which the map was used and the ready availability of phones with coordinating software changed the nature of the project. So the need to impose some order on the data we had originally collected became greater once we had made the map more widely available. Fairly obvious point. Stephen and I had started out looking at banal walking routes and dereliction on areas that we both knew within the North Inner City area. So others wish to add their own sites outside of the area. So what we've got is a tally then at the end of January of blue flag vacant sites. There's about 31 of these in the database. Boarded up houses, they're green flags, there's about 22 of those. Closed commercial, 55. Closed commercial ground floor, this is again the kind of the typology we're breaking out into about 15 of these. Closed institution are publicly owned, and I don't know why we distinguish between the public and the private, but maybe that's something we can look at tonight. Unclassified, which is 50 sites, because you always have to have another group, right? And then DCC, derelict property list. I might go back one, please. And there's about 31 on that derelict sites. Just go back one, yeah. Okay. So while the project still has no definition of what a derelict house or site is, the typology at least made a distinction between vacant sites, housing stock and commercial property. A distinction between closed commercial and closed commercial ground floor arises from the occurrence of many of these spaces in the Dublin City area. Of course, we still have not unpacked the unclassified category because, as I said, you always have to have an other category. So what next for this data? So this is maybe where we pick it up tonight. They continue to exist as places in the absence of any further public information on their ownership or usage. Many of the derelict sites have planning notices spanning several years on display, and more of them are within the NAMA process. So perhaps a next step tonight should be to systematically organise planning notices and relate them to their duration and distribution. So that's something we're looking into in the medium to longer term. And that's something you can do publicly online. So one of the aspects that needs development for this project is the formal linking of these sites and buildings with local placemaking, particularly in relation to the local government elections in 2014. Stephen and I have spoken about confining our interest to an area broadly defined by the River Liffey and the Grand Canal, transected by 3 main streets, and this is what's represented here in this map. This is the river, this is the North Circular Road, and what we've done here is just taken a few of the small area data and just mapped out a few of just to give you a sense of what the area looks like. I'm not going to dwell on the numbers aren't that important, but just to give you a sense of the scale of what we're looking at. Next one, please. This is the percentage of vacants by small area, and this came from the census 2011. Residential vacancy, okay. So we can see here that there's a kind of a large tranche of residential vacancy according to the census in this part of the town, which is towards the Docklands. And then we've got another cluster just to the west of that, and again back towards the Phoenix Park over here. This is Grange Gorman. Okay. So on to the next one, please. And this is, I just picked one of these variables randomly. This is the number of pre-family households. Again, just to give a sense of the occupation of these households. And again, we see a broad clustering just north of the river, and around about here by Manor Street, I think, or maybe that's Capel Street. I wasn't able to get the Dublin map on the back of it, but again, towards the Docklands, we're looking at clusters of higher numbers of pre-family households. And again, that's the definition used by the CSO itself. So we would walk systematically through each of these areas in turn, taking in all of these sites adjacent to these 3 streets and mapping all of the dereliction. And these are the 3 transects. So we have this here, and broadly speaking, one cutting down through Grange Gorman and Manor Street. Throughout the times that we can identify now as the boom, some of these places that we have mapped were transformed by flows of surplus capital and unsustainable credit. Many more were left to remain derelict throughout the boom. Now that the surplus capital has moved elsewhere, what has become of these places? How are these places made and remade through their non-use by speculative capital, but their everyday use by those who live and work and shop and play near these places? So what's the story behind these sites? In short, it's a fairly basic question that's central, at least to my understanding of geography, which is why here and not there. Okay. So in her 2011 project, Pathological Geographies, Emma Cummins puts forward the idea that to really understand the current financial crisis, and by extension the problems of capitalism itself, one needs to consider capitalism's erratic, contradictory character in relation to its concrete material effects. So Emma examined unfinished estates in Ireland, and thus why she looks at those, she says that they offer an opportunity for sustained and radical reflection. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here tonight and with these papers. So while she's looking at unfinished estates specifically, there's also a spatial politics to these sites that we've identified through our project. Many of the sites are unfinished in the sense that they began as the dream of a speculative process, anchored once by flows of capital through Dublin, and anchored again by the council's planning process. And this is facilitated by the development of the city as a European capital city. So many of the sites that we've looked at imply that they too are unfinished. They remain in all Ireland, rooted to a smaller city core which could only dream of sprawling suburbs, still living in the shadow of Victorian tenement life. So part of this project has been about seeing the city in a different way through walking around the city. So in the first chapter of his book, Rhythm Analysis, Lefebvre distinguishes between two approaches. I'm not going to linger on this either. One is about taking lots of different cases and drawing general conclusions. Another one is actually to build evidence up from below and to think about it as an accretion of evidence just in that space. No other way of thinking about it, just this is what it represents at this particular point. In this second approach to studying social space, the cyclical and the linear act together. But rhythm is always some form of measuring, but the unique quality of a rhythm is the binding of the qualitative and the quantitative, okay? So there's two things being joined here. So the work that we did to compile these data had a rhythm. So our footsteps, our heartbeats, the swinging of our arms, the chat and the talk about the sites as we approach them and how we catalogue them. So how are these aspects of the project measured, let alone mapped? What kinds of geographies arise from the process of mapping? How do we engage with the parts of the city that we walked in this new relationship? So this here is a trace. It's probably a little bit difficult to see at the back. This is a trace of Stephen and myself and a bunch of others walking down one of the transects and up another one of the transects. This is our stop off in the Black Sheep pub, and this is a walk we undertook with Maura and a few others. Starting from the cobblestone, actually, which is why it's in purple, because we spent a bit more time there. So this is about time versus distance, in effect. So what I'm trying to do is, how do the places that we walk become identified with the larger politics of the places in Dublin? So we can represent this walking as a series of squiggly lines, but this is actually how we might begin to represent and map out the city, rather than looking at it from above and seeing here's a point, here are zones of planning and so on. So in taking part in democratic processes for the election of local representatives next year, how can we bind the practices and the rhythm of everyday life onto the places that are themselves the outcome of larger processes of capital flowing? So I'm asking how these derelict sites, the material outcomes of human labour, are made political spaces. So how are they made ours for the purposes of political representation? So these spaces are produced and are often presented to us as spectres of processes seemingly beyond our political control. The phrase ghost estates is hardly accidental, albeit different from the occurrence of longer-term dereliction. These derelict sites and buildings that we have mapped are representations of space, but they're made to be representations of space by planning process and so on. So how can we make them spaces of representations, or spaces of the everyday, such as somebody writing on the derelict building around the corner here, someone should live here. So these are stories behind all these places, and what are these stories and how do we tell them and map them? So they're kept as spaces of specialised knowledge of the architect, the planner, the engineer, and so on. So these are deliberate and productive processes which carry within them specific uses. So for the purposes of creating spaces of representation, what can the mapping that we have done achieve other than to contribute to a spatial politics that makes them inaccessible to everyday politics? So these sites of dereliction are kept from being lived and remade. So at the end, I'm left with another question, which is what kinds of local politics opens these places up for daily use by those who live here? So that's my question I'm going to end on, and I'll pass over to Steve.
Right, so I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Eoin speaking about representations of the city and using maps as counter-representation, and then this question of rhythm and how rhythm can inform how we understand the city and how we can reclaim the city. And then I'm going to try and end on some very tentative suggestions for how politics could come out of what we've done, and how politics could come out of ways of seeing the city through maps and through counter-cartographies. First, I'm going to take a bit of a detour with a few maps and down to the Wicklow Mountains, and to talk about maps themselves. Right, maps they're powerful tools, but not so much for what they actually are, but then for what we think they do. We tend to think of maps as reflecting some sort of reality out there, some sort of faithful replication of the truth or what's real, or the facts on the ground are copied into that piece of paper or computer edition. But really, maps are as partial as anything else we do to interpret the world around us. There's too many facts on the ground to squeeze into any one map, right? So, just like there's too much out there to fit into any one project of analysis or any one work of art or any one piece of writing. So a cartographer, like any other person looking at the world outside, has to be selective in what they record, because otherwise they're going to have something that's just not going to be legible. They have to cut down and harrow down their observations. And the other thing about that, of course, is that maps are going to be, the selection of what people do for maps are going to be subjective, because maps are created by somebody with a certain experiences and a certain purpose in mind. What I think is interesting here, though, is what maps do to naturalise these subjective perspectives. They're more effective in some times than other forms of representation, at convincing people to internalise and to naturalise representations of the world, partial representations of the world, as something faithfully reflecting that outside. And sometimes even these representations are alien to people's experiences of actually living and being in the world. So take, for example, this is what coming to these maps, this of Wicklow, by Captain Alexander Taylor, who was a Royal Engineering officer and was in charge of constructing the Wicklow Way in the early 1800s. Maps like these they help make sense of what Eoin was talking about, and what Henry Lefebvre writes about the dialectic or the fruitful opposition between abstract conceptions of space, representations of space, as Eoin called it, and the way in which space is experienced through the everyday practices of living. Right, so the military road, it was built during the first decade of the 19th century to solve once and for all. Here's the road. Here's the route of the road going right down up to Tree Rock and Glencree, Glendalough there, and down to Glendalough. It was built to solve for once and for all the problem of Irish guerrillas using the mountains as a base for insurgency. Maps for the British Empire played a dual role for British military in encountering insurgency. First of all, they provided a means of reducing the insurgents' tactical advantage of familiarity with the terrain by translating spatial features into an abstract symbology that could be used to read whatever landscape a colonial officer might encounter. And second, get the next slide there, they created what Dennis Wood and John Krieger called a proposition. In other words, they ask us to interpret differently the configurations of spaces around us and to imagine an alternative spatial paradigm. The proposition in Captain Alexander's maps are of a Wicklow Mountains tightly linked to the garrisons of Dublin and the outposts along the routes in places like Glencree and Glenmalure. But the thing is, the abstractions in maps can't quite substitute for concrete knowledge of the terrain. I don't know if anyone's gone stuck in a peat hag in the Wicklow Mountains, they'd understand that after in the fog and after that maps let them in there. On the other hand, though, knowledge of the terrain, that's to say understanding of a place based on the lived experience of it, can become a potent counter-cartographic tool when combined with the mapping techniques of abstraction and proposition. Next slide there. I'll explain it now by turning to one of my favourite geographers and my favourite set of maps by Bill Bunge. Bill Bunge was American geographer from the 1960s, who was based in based in Detroit in the late 1960s during the upheavals and the riots in the city at that time. He founded the Detroit Geographical Expedition, along with his wife, who's an African American, to bring together academics and African American inner city high school students to map the effects of racism and middle class white flight and the effects of zoning on the inner city of Detroit in the late 1960s. There's a next one there as well. So you've got this one. I mean, Detroit, Detroit in legends, the car city, is famous as a place where car building and suburbanization and the vision for Detroit in the early 60s was of, as for many American cities, was of a city centre built of roads which could connect the suburbs very quickly into the centre. The white middle class left the city, left behind the poor working class, and it had then the effect of transforming cities, walkable city centre to a car-filled city centre, had its effects in fatalities of African American children, as this map says, at regular intersections. Interestingly, actually, this was one of the same catalysts for the Black Panthers in Berkeley. One of their first campaigns was similarly the effect, the fatalities among African American children from, again, suburban commuters. Right, next slide there, please. Oh, sorry, go back. Right. So, what proposition are Eoin and I making with our dereliction project? First, we're proposing that many of the private bits we glimpse through the fences and dirty windows on our north side walkabouts are not contributing to the collective life of the city. And second, we want to propose a different way of conceiving the city by producing new imaginaries of Dublin out of everyday life instead of the other way around. That the other way around being the big visions that are supposed to shape our own practices of everyday life. Right, so our first proposition, that there are parts of Dublin gathering dust or slowly disappearing beneath the Budlia, seems blatantly obvious, right? Next slide. But strangely, they tend to be ignored in Dublin's representations of the city. This map is taken from Dublin City Council's Your City, Your Space document, which sets out a strategy for the public realm, defined as the roads, streets, lanes, parks, squares and bridges of the city, as the public accessible space between buildings, along with the spaces and the buildings or other structures that enclose them. Public realm strategy, I like it. It's a welcome strategy. Anything that enhances the public spaces we use and the shared spaces we use, that's something to be welcomed, and it's a good, nice new focus from the council. The thing is, in focusing our attention on the parts of the city in which we are free to move through, at the same time it leaves, strangely unremarked, the realm of private property, other than as facades enclosing the public city. There's one pilot project that grew out of the strategy that encroaches to a certain extent on the private parts of the city by trying to make uses of derelict sites along the Lewis line from O'Connell Street to Commons Barracks. The planners have come up with some imaginative ideas for using the sites, like the art tunnel at the bottom of Smithfield, and they proposed a community garden for the Hammond Lane OPW site, and a pop-up park that we might know about on Abbey Street. The problem, though, is that these are essentially mothballing strategies aimed at keeping the streetscape from reverting to how it looked back in the 80s, while we wait for the owners of these sites to find ways of developing them profitably. This problem is partly due to the Constitution's protection of private property rights and how that right's been interpreted in the courts. But there's something more as well to it. Private property seems to be regarded as inhabiting a separate realm with a different set of rhythms to that of what is regarded as a public city. By accepting this, we leave unquestioned that complex irrational system of property capitalism
that Eoin described. In addition to the rhythm of our walkabouts, our collective urban existence can be described through a myriad of rhythms unfolding at different geographical scales and different tempos. One of these might be the abstract but real economic cycles of capital ebbing and flowing through the city, in the form of credit capital in the one direction and rent in the reverse. And if you want to go to the next. This is sort of representation that people will be familiar with from, repeated economic prognostications of the future picking up, or from the media's constant harping on about house prices recovering. So I did a really awful job of trying to represent these flows.
We represented them last time.
And this is the problem about representing abstractions. So if you're going to represent the flows, you have this is the Celtic tiger boom stuff. Capital coming in through the banks and the IFSC. We circulating through the city we make the north and the inner city and elsewhere, and going back out through developer country, back into the banks and back out of the country. And then, the price of land then is influenced by other rhythms outside the country, like flow of credit between global financial centres and the relative strength or weakness of employment and consumption levels elsewhere in the world. With all these wider circuits moving slowly at the moment, these sites are set to remain undeveloped until things improve. So get the next slide there. And this is how maybe the map might look according to this view of cycles. Would show the flows have dried up, or perhaps coming in a different direction, though smaller, from the new white knight of real estate investment trusts coming to buy property in the cheap in Dublin. And meanwhile, capital is still flowing out of the country from our higher tax rates and from the mortgages we continue to pay. And this little arrow is supposed to represent Department of Finance. We're working this a bit more now. So meanwhile, while all this is happening, while things aren't moving, the owners and developers spending their time dealing with their debts, looking for opportunities elsewhere, or simply sitting on their properties until conditions are more propitious for profit. But the thing about land is that it doesn't convert all that easily into abstract flows of capital. Capital is sunk into the land and into constructing buildings in the expectation that it will be recouped over the long term in the form of rents paid for the privilege of accessing and using them. However, as Eoin pointed out, some of these rhythms are linear, not cyclical. In other words, they don't go back to the starting point. What was previously built and done affects what is possible next time out. Just like the military road tipped the balance of power away from the rebels and towards the colonists, the construction of the built environment has ramifications for future efforts to finance development. Land is thus not so simple that it can simply be turned into something that can be swapped in financial centres. This happens for a reason. Individuals, businesses and organisations use these buildings according to different rhythms of production, consumption and living that don't necessarily, in fact usually don't coincide with the temporality of the circuits of finance. The reason for this is because of the rhythms that really make a city. These are the rhythms that mark the way Dublin's residents and the people who pass through the city perform the practices of everyday living. Some of the rhythms follow cycles: birth, love, deaths, wake, work, sleep, eat, dance, defecate. And these everyday practices are accompanied by linear rhythms as we build the stories that explain the meanings we attach to where we live. This is where the usefulness of a city is ultimately to be found, in the collective rhythms of people doing their thing, alone and together, and in sharing stories about why they're doing it. Now, this is from my actual PhD work on. Have anyone heard of Miles Wright? He was an English planner who produced a report on recommending new towns be built in the west of Dublin, from which grew Blanchardstown, Lucan, Clondalkin, and Tallaght, and the western suburbanisation of Dublin. This is Miles Wright kind of represents the big plans that that usually through which Dublin has been developed for much of its modern history, or even stretching back to things like the Wide Street Commissions, where the big plans created proposals, abstract renditions of how we should live, and then living patterns had to reflect the plans of those who drew them up. But unfortunately, these plans have tended to favour the abstract rhythms of private property capital over the lived rhythms of the city. Many of the sites we map tell a story of repeated attempts to fix problems, like the movement of industry and population to the suburbs by recourse to property speculation. Thus, for example, we've got the ex-Maguire and Patterson site on Hammond Lane, the copper works across from it, or the Docklands, the closing down or being replaced with the IFSC. Next. This is what David Harvey describes as a spatial fix. Harvey uses the word fix deliberately for its dual meanings. The first is the way in which capital is fixed in one place in the form of property, so that it can be returned over a longer time frame. The second, though, is the awkward problem that capital always faces at some stage, which is that to be released from the property, someone is going to have to lose out. Some capital is going to have to be destroyed in order to release the capital back into the form of abstract flows of money. The latter is what property developers mean when they speak excitedly about creative destruction. So knocking down the north of Connell Street, this is the Carlton development, the council development. Behind it, Moore Street, which is long years of organic use. This is to be not the council. One of the council's big flagship projects still is to knock this down to rebuild it as another consumption paradise and shopping centre. Because what is creative destruction for the developer is often just simple destruction for the resident, with the added bonus of dispossession and displacement. We can see this in how the North Side was developed since the 1960s. The dock and factory jobs moved out to be replaced with the IFSC and gentrification, and the tenements were torn down to make way for what was the planners first planned as dual carriageways, and what ended up as 1 and 2 bedroom apartments built by Liam Carroll and aimed at the buy-to-rent sector rather than the occupier. And it still persists, I'd argue, in the notion of Dublin as smart creative city. Like this notion of the new cultural quarter for Parnell Square, borrowed as it is from the likes of Richard Floyd and Ed Glazer and their shallow analyses of US urbanism. Right, so this brings me to our second proposition of organising Dublin out of everyday life instead of seeking to make everyday life conform to our plans for the city. The current economic crisis brings to mind Antonio Gramsci's description of the conditions that gave rise to fascism in Italy. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born, he said. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. But this interregnum has lasted long enough now for us to discern great glimpses of the new amidst the apparently prevailing morbidity. The council's dereliction project in Abbey Street that I mentioned, this studio, I think, and then Mick and Paddy's Provisional University. There are 3 such glimpses, suggesting an openness to experimenting with different fora and new ways for collective life in Dublin. The methods these examples suggest are not necessarily pretty, nor are they easy to copy and paste into other settings. The process of turning them into something more potent probably depends on organic methods and is contingent on local specificities and relations, rather than something that can be abstracted into a model that can be easily copied. There's one obstacle I think many of these experiments share, and that their prospects are constrained by the legal and political structures that privilege private property over shared collective production. At issue then is not so much the alternative imaginaries of these unused and derelict spaces, but the permanence of any reappropriation of collective space from private property. This is the point, I think, where politics comes back into play. I don't know, I can only suggest what such politics might look like. It might begin from a campaign to open access to some of the sites we've mapped, built on an engagement with residents or passers-by based on specific local needs. So, for example, this site on Church Street might build on the residents of flats, their objections to earlier proposal for planning permission to build apartment buildings on it. They objected because of space concerns and light concerns. Next one. I'm sorry, these are just, again, as I said, these are tentative ideas to start. people thinking. This site in Abbey Street, this is where the council tried to propose the pop-up park that didn't work out. This is bigger because this has got passers-by. Maybe this would be built on a different campaign, built on people's use of the centre of the city rather than residents. And then the next one. This is Hammond Lane, which is owned by the OPW. So again, we've got a different scale of problem, which requires a different scale of engagement. So maybe something like this would require a central level of lobbying and campaigning. This is where the council planners suggested building a sunken community garden, which again brings up its own set of questions too about what community is this garden going to? What community is going to garden? So again, these proposals have to be grasped. Have to be engaged with to turn into anything. The first hurdle for any of these campaigns or any campaign like this would be in finding ways of accessing the sites long enough to develop a sustainable level of collective engagement, in the hope that public support for the new use will outweigh the drive to revert the site to private control. My working theory here is that occupation by a large and determined group of citizens is, if not 99% of the law, at least it's a good chunk of politics. Now, I'm not naive enough to suggest all these campaigns in and of themselves would be capable of ending the privileged position of private property. But where I think the value of campaigns like this and the counter-cartography that might inform them is in changing the discursive grounds on which we build our claims to the city. I hope it would open up what was an exclusive private realm to politics based on collective use, needs and occupations, by getting people to ask the simple question, whose city is this? That's it. Thanks.